morning, everybody. I'm coming to you from New York City. It's the Christopher Hahn Show. We're talking about politics here from a progressive point of view. A lot going on in the world these days, guys. It is insane out there. We got Syria issues. Israel deciding to take matters into their own hands over the weekend. Lots going on, but I think probably the craziest thing I've seen this weekend is Glenn Beck at the NRA and the NRA's new president, Mr. Porter, who had chaired their legal committee very successfully, I might add. But a guy who's not quite living in the 21st century. He still calls the Civil War the war of northern aggression, and he's going to lead the nation's largest gun lobby. Of course, Wayne LaPierre, its executive vice president, is really the executive director, but this is the guy who's going to be out there saying, "Pry it from my cold, dead hands," every day to Congress. But the Chris Hahn Show today brought to you by the Ad Council. We're going to talk a little bit about child passenger safety. I don't know if did you know that motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for children ages 1 to 13? And that the fatality rate could be reduced by about half if the correct car seat were always used. 3 out of 4 kids are not as secure in the car as they should be because their car seats are not being used correctly. By visiting safecar.gov/the right seat, parents and caregivers can find out what the right car seat for their child age and size is. Be sure you're sure. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Guys, very important. Make sure your kids are safe in their car. I make sure my kids safe every day. But you know what? We got to keep our kids safe every day wherever they are by taking guns away from people who shouldn't have them. But yet the NRA and about 46 members of the United States Senate, they don't want to check backgrounds on anyone. They feel that that is an infringement on the Second Amendment. And I got to tell you something. I've been talking about the Second Amendment all year. Maybe you read my piece in Politico or in Topics or on hypervocal.com. But, you know, I think the Second Amendment is null and void. I think that it hasn't been in effect the way the founders intended it since the 1920s when we banned machine guns because of all the Tommy gun killings going on here in New York City and other places around the country, brought to you by the mafia. But I got to tell you something. There are people in this country who believe that the Second Amendment is the only right in this Constitution who is absolute. They don't care if your right to search and seizure is violated when you go to the airport, have to take off your shoes, or, you know, if somebody's going to use a X-ray to check your house for marijuana plant lights or things of that nature. But the Second Amendment, which really has been null and void for years, that's the one they care the most about because they feel it protects all the other rights, even though they don't care so much about the other rights. Let me talk to you about why I think the Second Amendment is null and void. Now, most of the people on the left will say to you that the founders could not possibly have foreseen machine guns and other things. But I'll tell you what, the founders did foresee that. The founders wanted the citizens to have the same weapons that the government had because the protection was not for hunting, was not for home protection, was not for your own personal safety. The protections given to you by the Constitution and the Second Amendment were to protect you against the government. Jefferson believed that the tree of liberty needed to be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That's why he put the Second Amendment into the Constitution. Well, we're going to talk about that this hour and on this show today. A little later on, we're going to have Ron Christie, who was a special assistant to former President George W. Bush and a great guy, president of Ron Christie Strategies, a good friend of mine. We've been on Fox together. We've been on Current together. We've been on the Joy Behar Show together. Ron and I love talking politics. We're going to actually be writing a column together very shortly for USA Today or some other networks. Ron will be joining us to talk about it, and we're also going to have my good friend, Hollywood actor Lou Jimenez. Lou is an interesting guy. He is a libertarian, and he's a true libertarian, not a Republican libertarian, but a libertarian in the truest sense of the word. And he's got some very interesting views on it. But let's talk a little bit about the Second Amendment and why it's null and void. I mean, look, nobody today, no rational person, I should say today, believes that the government should be overthrown. Now, maybe Glenn Beck this weekend over at the NRA, maybe he's starting to believe that. I mean, he thinks Obama is this tyrant because he believes that little kids should have access to quality, affordable health care. And he thinks that that's some sort of socialist plan to overthrow America. I find him laughable. I find him a clown on the stage. But I have to admit, he's a great entertainer, because that really is what he is. He's an entertainer. But he's becoming dangerous, I think, in this country. I think his whole marketing scheme is to get people to purchase things they don't need in the case that the government falls. I mean, you see it with gold. This is a guy who spent his time at Fox really pushing gold as his primary sponsor. He's doing it now on his own network, The Blaze, which is actually now going to be broadcast on Cablevision across New York City and Long Island and some of the other areas that Cablevision broadcasts in. His whole scheme is to get people to be afraid of the government so that they buy the products that he's pushing right now. He's really a capitalist in the worst sense of the word. I mean, I don't even know how to, an opportunist of some sort. He creates this fear. And there's a certain segment of America who will always believe that fear, at least when there's a Democrat in the White House, and especially this Democrat whose name they find a little strange and whose color of their skin might not quite be to their taste. So Glenn Beck has taken that fear and he's made a market for it. Survivalists believe in him. People are buying gold because Glenn Beck feels the government overthrows. Let me tell you something, America. If you're buying gold because you think that the government might fall, you're out of your mind. If we're ever to a place in this country where gold is the new currency, you're better off having a cow so at least you could trade the milk for something or survive off the milk or eat the damn cow. Nobody's going to be taking your gold if the country falls. That's not what's going to happen in America. We're not going to ever come to a place where we're trading gold instead of currency, and that is going to be okay. Listen, little old lady, I'm going to just take your gold from you if that's what happens. If we really want gold, buy a cow, invest in crops, if that's what you're afraid of. But Glenn Beck will sell you gold. He'll sell you tents. He'll sell you survival kits, all in the case that America may fall. But this weekend, the NRA, which controls probably 45% of Congress, by the way, 45% of Congress is controlled by this group. Glenn Beck was their keynote speaker. And Glenn Beck asked the question, are we all going insane? I don't think we're all going insane, Glenn, but you sure are. And God, the people who listen to you, they are out of their mind because they believe the Second Amendment should be there to protect the other amendments. And they believe that the Second Amendment will protect us. So do they believe that we should have nuclear submarines in our backyard so we can fight the government? I mean, I've heard Republicans over the years talk about Second Amendment solutions to problems in America. You know, problems like the stock market reaching all-time highs and the jobless rates declining and disasters being met with competence and not some former horse trainer who is running our federal disaster relief in America as it was under Bush, Brownie. We all remember how the heck of a job Brownie did. Yeah, America is a horrible place now that President Obama has fixed things in this country from the mess left to him by George W. Bush. And of course, I'm going to talk to one of his former aides in about 5 minutes, who actually is a great guy. And I look back on the Bushies as reasonable people compared to some of these Tea Party types and the Glenn Beck followers of the world. You know, I mean, look, they may have had a different approach to government and they may have led us into a war that we didn't need. But you could negotiate with the Bush people and come to reasonable solutions on things. The Glenn Beck followers of the world, there's no negotiating with them because it's not politics to them. It's religion. And I'm not talking about Christianity or Judaism or Muslim or Islam or Hinduism. Their religion is their political beliefs. And in their religion, Democrats are the devil. Now, I know Glenn Beck likes to talk about how, you know, there's a battle between good and evil in America today. And I know that Glenn Beck thinks that I'm evil and President Obama's evil and that the Republican Party is the last hope of virtue in America and that gun owners are the ones who are going to protect us in America. I don't think Glenn Beck's ever really read the Bible, though. I know he hasn't read Matthew 25, that which thou doth do unto the least of them, you do unto Christ. Because if he did, he might not be so critical of food stamps and health care for the poor. You know, he might be a person who believes in helping people, doing whatever he can to lift people up so they could be productive members of society. And I know government isn't always right. Now there's some legitimate arguments on the right on how to improve the way government delivers services. And that used to be the battle in this country. How will we deliver these services? Now the battle in this country is, should we deliver these services? It is a bad line, and the direction this country is going in is going to be bad for a lot of people, and it will lead to the kind of problems that the Republican Party fears if it gets out of hand. Well, hey, look, we're going to talk guns this entire hour. I got a great lineup for you. Ron Christie coming up next, and a little later on, my good friend Lou Jimenez, libertarian extraordinaire and a budding star in Hollywood. Can't wait to talk to Lou. But we'll be right back on the Chris Hahn Show. Stay where you're at. You don't have to be a perfect person to be the perfect parent. There are thousands of teens in foster care who don't need perfection, they need you. For more information on how you can adopt, go to adoptuskids.org. All right, you're back on the Christopher Hahn Show. Coming up shortly, Ron Christie. But let me just wrap up the last thought. Look, most Americans agree, 90% of Americans agree that background checks will help save lives. And like seatbelts, you know, it's not going to solve every problem with guns in this country, but it's going to solve some. And I'm willing to take that chance. I'm willing to do that. This right-wing conspiracy that somehow background checks is going to lead to a federal registry that's going to take away the gun rights of honest Americans is just bunk. And it's time for us to get off that and start moving towards reasonable solutions. We know that there are some people out there who should not have guns. And if there's a way for us to take those guns out of their hands, God, we are responsible for the lives they take if we don't take that chance now and do it. And I'm very hopeful that the Senate will bring this up again in the next couple of weeks, and we'll have a different result, and we'll move on. It's a very sensible solution, and it's not going to take the guns away from anybody who should have it. All right. Joining me right now is a very good friend of mine, Ron Christie, who was a senior aide, special aide to former president of the United States, George W. Bush. And Ron and I have done a lot together on Fox and on the Joy Behar Show and on some other outlets over the years. And Ron, it's great to have you with me. Ron Christie, president,
a pleasure, my friend.
President of Christie Strategy. So Ron, I know you're on top of the guns thing, and I'd like to get your side of this. I've been giving a very progressive slant the last 15 minutes or so, but Ron, I look at you as one of the more reasonable, sensible Republicans in America who, if the Republican Party were more like you, I think the Democratic Party might be in real trouble in 2016. But right now, I think the Republican Party is more concerned about Mr. Porter, the new president of the NRA, and the Glenn Becks of the world. What's your thought?
Well, my take on this, and I think that your read into this is exactly right. I think that background checks are overwhelmingly supported by the American people. Polls have indicated as many as 90% of the American people are in favor of some expanded background check. I don't have a problem with a background check per se. I just want to make it very clear, and I think that all of us would recognize that we need to do everything that we can to take the guns out of the hands of criminals, but I do not believe an expanded background check would have prevented the tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, nor do I think it would have prevented the tragedy in Colorado where the deranged gunmen shot those folks in the Batman movie.
Well, I mean, whether it could prevent what has happened or might prevent things in the future, I think that most Americans will agree, and I think you'll agree with me, Ron, is that it might prevent something from happening. And look, these guys, the guy in Colorado was clearly deranged and had some interactions with the law. The guy in Newtown had not had any interaction with the law, but he was clearly deranged, and there had been some recognition of that in his record. And whether or not they would have sold it to him, they probably wouldn't under the extended background checks. He got his gun from.
Here's where I think the president. Oh, go ahead.
He got his gun from his mom, and I think his mom probably should have taken better precautions to make sure that her son, who she knew was clearly troubled, could not access those guns.
No, that's absolutely right, and I think you certainly don't want to lay blame at the feet of a woman who was murdered by her son. But I think we would both agree that she should have taken a better opportunity to have had those weapons locked up, and that he didn't have access to them.
Right.
But here's where I think the president made a big mistake. I think the president, on the heels of what had happened again, a tragedy in Newtown, went around with those victims' parents, went around with Gabby Giffords, the former congresswoman from Arizona, and others who are pro-gun folks, and said, shame on you if you don't agree with us. You're not being a good American. I think he politicized to an extent that if he had frankly come out and said, this is something, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, if you're a sensible person and you believe that we should take the guns out of those who should not have them, let's have an expanded background check. I think this would have sailed to the Senate and sailed through the House, but I think the president made it very personal, and he was insulting in some of the language that he used to describe his opponents, and I think that's why it went down. It was more about people saying, I'm not going to let you talk to me that way, Mr. President, than it was, do we really need to have extended background check?
Ron, to defend the president here, I mean, this Congress doesn't like anything this president comes up with. I think the solution he put out there, and that actually was the Manchin Toomey solution, I think was a very sensible, watered-down solution. I mean, God, if it was up to me, it would be a much stronger background check. And I would create a federal registry, quite frankly. I don't see what the big deal is here. We want to know where these bullets are going. We want to know where these guns are going. I think that the president, yes, I think that this Congress will turn its nose at the president at any chance it gets, using any excuse it can. And the victims going out there and lobbying for this, I think that was a very strong, powerful message. We see victims of terrorist attacks and of other tragedies going out there and advocating for causes. I don't see why the parents who lost their kids can't deal with their grief by pushing for safety measures that might help other parents not have to deal with the same problem in the future. So I know that the Republicans and that there's been a lot of rhetoric on the right about this being done, but Ron, I mean, what are these parents to do?
Well, again, I think these parents, I can't even imagine the unmistakable grief they're going through. And if they believe that would have helped at least ease some of the pain they're going through and make sure that other parents don't have to go through it, I'm for it. I'm saying that I think that the president was, frankly, manipulative in his exploitation of these parents. I don't blame them. I just think the president made it far too personal of, well, if you don't support this, then you're in favor of another Newtown. And the only other thing I'd say, my friend, is that it's not this Republican Congress that is holding the president back. It's Harry Reid, who has a 100% rating from the National Rifle Association, who's the Senate Majority Leader, who couldn't get a majority of his caucus to vote for this.
Well, wait. 90% of Democrats voted for this. 90% of Republicans voted against this. So it wasn't Harry Reid that held up background checks. He lost 4 votes. I mean, that's not a lot of votes to lose. And those people are now hearing it from their constituents. And that's why I think you're going to see this come back. Even, look what happened to Kelly Ayotte, the Republican freshman senator from New Hampshire. She went home last weekend and she took a beating from her constituents, including some people from Newtown who drove up to be at her town hall. I think you're going to see some changing of the minds of how we're going to do this. And she, of course, fell back on the National Registry of Gun Owners excuse, which is clearly debunked. In fact, the law says makes it a crime to create a federal registry. And yet Kelly Ayotte, a member of the United States Senator, told a victim's mother that that's why she voted against it. I find that despicable. And I think when she comes back to Washington, she's going to have to ask herself a question about, where is she on this? And she's going to change her tune if she wants to get reelected.
Well, I definitely think this vote's going to come back, and I think it's going to come back sooner rather than later. I think Kelly Ayotte, who you mentioned from New Hampshire, Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, other conservatives who are perceived as being mainstream have gone home over the last couple of weeks and really taken an earful from their constituents. So I wouldn't be surprised, and that's the reason that Harry Reid, from a procedural standpoint, voted against the background check bill so that he could then bring it back up. I wouldn't be surprised, Chris, if we see this bill come back up in less than a month, and I also wouldn't be surprised to see it get that 60-vote majority. I
think you're right, Ron, and let's hope. But let me just go back to the NRA for 1 second. We were talking about Newtown for a second. And we also talked about gun safety. You know, when I was a kid, the NRA was not this political movement that it is now and that has become over the last 20 years. The NRA was the place you went to learn how to use a gun safely and store a gun safely. Is it a problem in America today that there really isn't a group that's what they do? I mean, the NRA does still do that. But there are a lot of Americans who may even be gun owners who don't want to turn to the NRA because of what they perceive as a radical political agenda. And perhaps if the Newtown shooter's mother had been to the NRA and learned how to store her gun safely, perhaps it could have prevented a tragedy. I mean, is there a need in this country for a group that was what the NRA was maybe 20, 30 years ago, that really preached how to use a gun safely and appropriately?
Well, I still think that's their core mission and their core values. I have been a strong supporter of the NRA. I believe very strongly in what you've said, and their mission is, which of course is to inform and educate and allow people the opportunity to purchase firearms and to store them responsibly. They certainly have been very active. Certainly here in Washington, D.C., I would count them in the top 3, if not the top 2 advocacy groups who have the most influence and power.
Right.
And I think that's due to the fact that they have millions of members around the country who believe in the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms uninfringed and unabridged by the government.
Well, but when you have a guy like Glenn Beck as your keynote speaker at your convention, how is a mainstream guy like myself, who may like to go skeet shooting, which I do, quite frankly, I enjoy it, how am I going to join or use that organization for anything? I mean, I look at that organization as a radical extremist group. And I know that you've been a supporter of them, Ron. I don't consider you an extremist at all. But I mean, there are a lot of people in this country in the middle and on the left, quite frankly, who may or may not use firearms for recreational purposes or some other purposes, that are low to purchase anything or go to any seminars or be involved with any training that's sponsored by the NRA because of this radicalization of that group over the last couple of years.
Well, I think change has to come from within. And I think a reasonable guy like yourself who is concerned with some of their advocacy efforts and some of the messages that they've been putting out there, they would need a guy like you where you could go and you could stand up and say, this is not me. This is not the sort of values that I embrace and the ideals that I support. And let's take a step back, and let's take a step back from the rhetoric. I mean, I've found in my career in politics over 20 years that the old adage, if you can't beat them, join them, comes to mind. And certainly many of the people that I've disagreed with, you know, and you and I have done this over the years on television, that you can actually sit down and say, okay, Chris, where do you and I agree rather than disagree? And let's use that as a bridge to build other relationships and to move forward. And I think that's what we need to do, looking at groups like the NRA, for those who believe, like you, that they may have overstepped the line.
I hear you, Ron. It's hard to do it when you got a guy like Wayne LaPierre who is, you know, look, 10 years ago, Wayne LaPierre was for background checks. I guess he was for background checks before he was against it. Now you got a guy, John Porter, the new president coming in, who's living in the 19th century. He still calls the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. It just becomes hard for me to kind of take them seriously, or take them. You know, to me, you know, they are a new Tea Party group, or a more organized, better funded Tea Party group that I think is just dangerous right now. And I think you're right, though. Somebody on the inside of the NRA has got to stand up and say, you know, enough's enough. We've got to get back to our core mission of training people how to use firearms safely and the appropriate storage of firearms and things of that nature. I don't know if that's ever going to happen at least in the short term, Ron. I mean, who knows? Anything is possible, and I've seen radical change in my life, as I'm sure you have. But I am not hopeful that organization is going to be mainstream anytime soon. In fact, to me, it's becoming a far-right arm of the Republican Party. So Ron, thank you so much for joining us. What do you got coming up? Anything good?
Well, first of all, always a pleasure to join you. It's going to be a busy week here in Washington. A lot of advocacy going on. A lot of people wondering what's going on in their government. That's what I'm up to.
Excellent, Ron. Well, you keep doing what you're doing, and I will see you on TV soon. And we're going to be writing our piece soon, hopefully.
I look forward to it.
I'm looking forward to it, Ron. Ron Christie, former aide to President George W. Bush and president of Ron Christie Strategies. Ron, always a pleasure. We'll be right back.
Take care.
On the Christopher Hahn Show.
It just takes some time, little girl, and a little
All right, welcome back to the Christopher Hahn Show. You know, as a parent, you can't help but look at your child and dream about what the future holds. But while you're dreaming, consider this. The odds that your child will be diagnosed with autism are 1 in 88. Knowing the signs of autism and catching it early can make a world of difference. To learn the signs, visit autismspeaks.org. Brought to you by Autism Speaks and the Ad Council. And we're back. I want to thank my last guest, Ron Christie. I think that was an interesting conversation, and I think progressives all over America are pretty happy that the Ron Christies of the Republican Party are on the outs, because if they were on the ins, we probably would have a harder time winning elections nationally. I mean, Ron's a real rational guy, real reasonable guy, and a very smart guy, and if the Republicans were listening to him better and more often, you know, we'd have some troubles. But joining me now is a great guest. Lou Jimenez is probably one of the funniest guys in America. You don't know him yet, but you will know him soon. He's got a movie out right now making the circuit of film festivals with some of the guys from Kids in the Hall. I'll let him talk about it. It's called The Immigrant, and it is a hilarious take at the immigration problem. Lou Jimenez, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, Mr. Hahn. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for waking up early out there in L.A. I do appreciate the time. Why don't you, before we talk politics, why don't you tell us a little bit about The Immigrant? You got out there making the film festival circuit. I saw it here in New York a couple of months ago, and I was blown away by it.
Yeah, no, it's a cool little short film. Sort of a little take on our immigration, and it's just a funny spin on it. You know, it's just, instead of a Mexican trying to get into the United States, it's a Canadian trying to get into the United States, but he sneaks in as a Mexican. So
exactly.
Yeah, so it's really funny.
And who's in it? Dave Foley and
we got Scott Thompson, Michael Cera, Dave Foley, Margaret Cho. It was pretty cool, man.
It is great.
Cool,
it's fantastic. So look out for that. It's coming to a film festival near you, and I think it'll be in other formats shortly. And Lou Jimenez is one of the stars in that movie. And I always say, you know, immigration's been a problem in this country ever since the guys who came here on the first boat saw the second boat coming and saying, "What are we going to do about those guys?" Right. But I think that the way that this film kind of looks at it and says, "Wow, look at this! It's a Canadian sneaking in." It was a real comical take on a very serious and important topic. But Lou, the reason I got you on here today is because you are a true libertarian. I am. Not a Republican who pretends to be a libertarian, but a real libertarian. You believe not only in freedoms from the government, in taxation and other policies, but you believe in personal liberty as well, which I think is great. How did you come to become a libertarian?
Oh, that's such a funny story. Yeah, it's not really that funny. I think it's sort of the way a lot of young libertarians have sort of found the Libertarian Party, and the biggest reason was about 8 or 9 years ago, right before the 2012 now?
Yeah, 2013, man.
Right before the 2008 election, I had come across Ron Paul, and it just made sense. Out of all the talking heads on stage, out of everyone, the one that made sense was Ron Paul, and I just started looking into the libertarian movement and what it meant to be a libertarian, and how, you know, the word freedom is tossed around a lot in these Democratic and Republican parties, as if, you know, oh, well, you know, we're fighting for our freedom, our soldiers are fighting for your freedom, but what does freedom really mean, you know, and what the definition of freedom and personal liberty and what those things really, really mean.
Right. You know, I find when I see Ron on the stage at these debates, or when he was debating, I agree with him half the time. When he's talking about personal freedom, when he's talking about the war on drugs, when he's talking about things of that nature, I agree with him. But then when he starts talking about some of the programs that the government has put in place to kind of lift the poor up, I mean, I know, look, I grew up poor in New York. My family was on welfare almost my entire life. I went to college as an EOP student here in New York, which, you know, but for that, I wouldn't have had the money to even apply to college when I was a kid. Yeah. And I'm very grateful for those services because they lift me up. But I think, you know, when we talk about true libertarianism, like you are, we talk about the government getting out of the way of Americans in their personal and in their public lives. And
Right.
I think, when you talk about the war on drugs, we spend so much money incarcerating Americans who basically have a problem. And we probably could take that money invested in this people and spend half the money just trying to get them clean and getting them, jobs so they don't do drugs.
Oh, yeah. Well, going back to what you said first, the social programs that we're talking about, like welfare and things like that. Now, when he was discussing those things on stage, the thing that, and I also was like, well, you can't just knock out welfare programs.
Right.
But, his explanation, I think, and was very eloquent. Well, listen, if we're fighting 4 wars, we can't afford these welfare programs. We can't do both. So why don't we save the money on the wars, take care of the people that are dependent on this welfare, and let's wean them off of it. Let's get everybody off welfare. Because I think if everybody has money in their pocket, I think naturally American citizens are very giving people. Anytime there's a disaster, anytime there's anything, the first people to send money are American citizens.
Right.
So I don't think welfare is the answer. Obviously there are people that need it, and I think those people that need it should keep it.
Right.
But if we're talking about future generations, the next kids that are coming, down the pipe, I don't think giving them welfare is the answer. And so that's sort of my take on the welfare issue as far as Ron Paul goes. But yeah, the war on drugs is ridiculous. It's just another form of prohibition, and that's, I think that's the biggest thing that I dislike about the government is they prohibit you from taking whatever drugs you want. They prohibit you from a lot of things.
And I think that this the rise of the prison industrial complex, these private prisons, they need people to be in those prisons or they don't make any money. So we're going to see these drugs laws persist.
The only person who mentioned the prison industrial complex was Ron Paul.
Right.
It's real funny. Like these people that would call Ron Paul a racist. The only guy that pointed out in the debates that the arrest records in prison systems are highly against the minority system. There's more minorities incarcerated in prison, by 80-90% more than whites, and the only person who pointed out was Ron Paul, and they have the temerity to call him a racist. Like he's sitting there pointing out the most racist thing in this country, and it's our prison system, and it's a business. It's not even there anymore.
That's the problem.
Purpose.
That's the problem with prisons today. Is a business. But let's turn to something else. Let's turn to
it's a commodity.
It is a commodity. The people are commodities, and that's a shame. And it's a scary thought, actually, because any one of us could fall into it.
I don't know how we live in a country where people are incarcerated for 10 years for having a marijuana joint.
It's amazing.
But they come out of prison 10 times worse than when they went in.
It's amazing. And that kind of turns. Let me just turn to our topic of the hour, which is guns, because the same people who are all pro throwing people in prison want to protect the one liberty that they really think they understand, and that's the right to bear arms in America.
Nobody understands the right to bear arms in America. It's very rare you find somebody who really, truly understands what that right means.
Well, I understand what that right means. I understand where it evolved from. I think the Second Amendment, I've said earlier today, look, Jefferson believed that the tree of liberty needed to be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And the Second Amendment is there not to protect you against somebody who might be robbing your house, not to go hunting, not to go clay shooting. The Second Amendment is there to protect you against a tyrannical government. But we don't really believe that we should overthrow the government anymore. So I believe that the Second Amendment doesn't make sense anymore. What's your thought?
Well, I can understand on how some points the Second Amendment doesn't make sense because it's not as relevant as it was 300 years ago or 200 years ago. But again, it's a prohibition. You're trying to put prohibition on a free society. If you try to prohibit a free society from doing something, they're going to find a way to do it, period, end of story. So if you try to prohibit people from getting guns, they're going to get a gun. If they want to kill somebody, they're going to find a gun, they're going to get it, and they're going to kill somebody. If you prohibit drugs, if somebody wants heroin, they're going to find heroin, they're going to use it, they're going to kill themselves, and it's a vicious cycle. You cannot stop people from prohibiting themselves from doing something they want to do.
But what about the fact that the Second Amendment itself says regulated in it, a well-regulated militia.
Hey, listen, I'm all for regulation of guns. I'm all for having a psychological test before you hand somebody an AK-47. I'm all for that. But the thing is that if people are seriously, if people were 1,000% serious about getting guns and violence out of America, the first thing that people should ask the government to do, if they want government to do anything, is to have the government disarm themselves.
Yeah.
Why does the government need 600 nuclear weapons? Why does our government need to be stationed in 130 different countries around the world and constantly on an offensive campaign as opposed to a defensive campaign?
That's a topic.
There's never been an imminent threat to the United States since Pearl Harbor.
That is the trillion-dollar question, and that's probably a topic for a whole nother show. Talking about our military presence around the world. And I believe that with all this sequester and all this other talk about cuts, the first place we should be looking is our defense budget, which I think has doubled in the last 10 years. And we got to end these wars, and we got to cut our defense budget down and move on. But Lou,
I'm not even so much cutting. Listen, I don't want to cut defense. I want to cut offense. I want to cut the countries around the world where we haven't even touched drone strikes. We haven't even touched any of that stuff.
I can do like 2 hours with you, Lou, but I only have one more minute, and I want to ask you about your films. What do you got coming up? What should people be looking at? Look, Lou, you're fantastic. Next time I'm going to do the show late in the day so I get you on California time.
Yeah. My brain is like catching up right now. But yeah, no, man, listen, you can find me on Twitter at Lou Angeles. I've got all sorts of film projects in the works right now. Nothing out of crazy, where you're like, oh my God, he's the new Penguin in, Cold Feet 3 or whatever it is.
You're not going to be the villain in Iron Man 4.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'll tell you what, man, Iron Man 3 was the most awful movie I've seen. Spoiler.
I got to tell you, I saw it. I thought it was okay. It wasn't great, but the best part about it for me was the Superman trailer. I can't wait for that. Lou Jimenez, thank you for joining me. I really do appreciate your viewpoints. You're fantastic, and we're going to look for you on Twitter at Lou Angeles, and we'll see you in the movies real soon. Lou, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be back with the Christopher Hahn Show after this short break.
Take my money, my cigarettes.
All right, we're back with the Christopher Hahn Show. Did you know there are 104,000 kids and 33,000 teens are currently waiting in foster care for adopted families? For more information on how you can adopt, go to adoptuskids.org. All right, wrapping up the show right now. Guys, I really do appreciate you joining us today. I think we got a lot to talk about when it comes to guns, when it comes to personal liberty in America. I think it's a debate worth having. I just wish we weren't having this sensationalized debate that they're having in Washington right now, where people like Kelly Ayotte will hang their hat on something like a federal gun registry, where the bill specifically states that there is a penalty, including prison, for creating a federal gun registry. Look, I'm in favor of a federal gun registry, but if this law passes, I will have no ability to do that. The Toomey Manchin bill that the Senate blocked last week would bar me from doing it, would fine me thousands of dollars if I wanted to put names in a book of who is buying guns and getting their backgrounds checked. Yet Kelly Ayotte will go to her constituents and say that's why she voted for the bill. Kelly Ayotte should not be in the United States Senate anymore, New Hampshire. Are you listening, New Hampshire? She's a liar. She lied to you. She knows that there's no federal registry being created by this bill. She read the bill. Kelly Ayotte is not Sarah Palin. I'm not giving her a pass for being an imbecile. Kelly Ayotte is intelligent. She knew what she was saying at that town hall meeting. She knew what she was doing when she casted that vote to block this bill from coming to an actual vote on the floor of the Senate. Kelly Ayotte knew what she was doing. Kelly Ayotte knows better. And the voters of New Hampshire are going to send Kelly Ayotte packing real soon, unless she changes her tune on this issue. Well, guys, I really do appreciate you joining us today here on the Christopher Hahn Show. It's been a pleasure being your host. We got a lot to talk about, America. We're going to keep talking. You keep listening. I'm Christopher Hahn. I'm your host. You can follow me on Twitter at Christopher Hahn. Find me on Facebook. I'm also ChristopherHahn.com. That's my website where you can get all my information, upcoming appearances, video, audio, everything else. We'll see you real soon. Thanks for joining us.